Welcome to the deep dive. Wars rarely just start with weapons firing.
Right.
They often begin much quieter, don't they? With rising tensions, old grudges, maybe, and a whole series of choices that, well, looking back, were all pointing towards danger.
And right now in the Middle East, we've definitely tipped over that edge.
Yeah.
It's not theoretical anymore. A real war has kicked off.
Yeah.
We saw Israel make that unprecedented first move, preemptive strike on Iran's nuclear sites.
hmm
And Iran didn't hesitate. They hit back hard. Hundreds of missiles. It's got the whole world watching very nervously.
Absolutely. So that's our mission for this deep dive. We want to unpack this whole thing. We'll dig into the history, the really deep roots that got us here.
Yeah, trace it.
And then look at what's happening right now, the dynamics in play, and crucially, what it all means globally, because it does affect all of us.
Exactly. The aim is to give you a really solid understanding. Why is this happening right now? Why is it escalating so fast? And, why does it make everyone feel so uneasy?
That's the core question, isn't it? Why now? And why does this conflict specifically send these ripples of anxiety across the whole world, way beyond the region itself?
Let's try and unravel it, piece by piece.
The deep roots of conflict: Iran, the United States, and Israel.
Okay, so let's start digging. When we talk about this current fighting, it's so important to get that this isn't something that just flared up overnight.
No, not at all.
The seeds were planted decades ago. And many people point to one specific moment as the real game changer, the start of this particular hostility. That's the 1979 Iranian Revolution.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how something that seemed like an internal shift, about Iran's own government and identity completely fractured the regional power balance.
Right.
Before 79, Iran looked very different. You had the Shah, the Pahlavi monarchy, very pro-West, a key U.S. ally, big oil supplier. The relationship was built on, shared interests, Western influence, those big oil deals with UK and U.S. companies. But the revolution just swept that away, and it set up something totally new, this unique theocratic state grounded in Shia Islam. It wasn't just a new leader, it was a complete ideological U-turn from being aligned with the West
To being fundamentally anti-West. And crucially, anti-Israel.
Exactly. And that ideological split created back then, you can still see its fault lines running through conflicts today. It's still shaping things.
So it wasn't just internal Iranian politics changing. It immediately created this huge friction, this deep animosity with the U.S. And there were these key early events that really locked it in, didn't they?
Absolutely. Defining moments.
You had the U.S. embassy seizure in Tehran. American hostages held for, 444 days.
Yeah, an incredibly long time.
That was seen everywhere as just a massive violation, almost an act of war. It left a really deep scar on U.S.-Iran relations that's never fully healed.
And then there was the oil. Iran just took over those huge Western oil concessions, British Petroleum, American companies, essentially nationalized assets that had been foreign-run for ages.
Direct actions, confrontational, setting the stage for decades of bad blood between Tehran and Washington.
And you can imagine how this looked from Israel's perspective, this radical transformation in Iran happening right next door, essentially.
Combined with Iran starting to think about nuclear capabilities.
Right. That combination immediately became, for Israel, the #1 existential threat in the entire Middle East. Israel's core security belief, it's always been this, it must be the only nuclear power in the region.
That strategic ambiguity thing where they don't confirm or deny having nukes.
Exactly. They see that as vital for deterring attacks. So any potential rival getting nuclear weapons, especially a country like post-79 Iran that's openly hostile, that sets off massive alarm bells, it's seen as an immediate challenge.
And it's not just about the nukes, is it? Israel also looks at Iran's widespread support for armed groups across the region. They see that as Iran basically engaging in war against them already, just indirectly, through proxies.
Yeah, that's a critical part of how Israel views the threat. It's this sophisticated proxy war strategy. Iran is actively working, Israel believes, to undermine its security using these other groups. Let's maybe break down who these key groups are.
Good idea. Because understanding them is key to understanding Iran's strategy and why Israel feels so threatened.
Okay, so Iran uses these groups, sometimes called its axis of resistance, to project power without needing a direct fight. It gives them influence, deniability sometimes.
While still putting pressure on their enemies.
Exactly. First, you've got Hamas in Palestine. Iran's been backing Hamas for a long, long time. Money, weapons, training.
Which lets Hamas challenge Israel directly from Gaza, right? Rockets, incursion.
Precisely. For Iran, supporting Hamas achieves several things. It counters Israeli and U.S. influence there, keeps pressure on Israel's border, and it boosts Iran's image as, defending the Palestinian cause, which plays well across the Muslim world.
And Israel sees that as just fueling terrorism, a constant security drain.
Then there's Hezbollah in Lebanon. Now, Hezbollah is arguably Iran's most powerful proxy, almost like an extension of Iran's own Revolutionary Guard.
They're incredibly well armed, aren't they?
Hugely. Massive funding from Iran, advanced weapons, we're talking a huge number of missiles, many precision-guided, plus lots of training. They're a serious military force right on Israel's northern border.
Posing a threat of a two-front war, potentially.
A very credible threat. They could launch thousands of rockets, maybe even try ground attacks. They're a major force in Lebanon itself, almost a state within a state, hugely important for Iran strategically.
So when you look at Hamas and Hezbollah, Israel basically feels like it's already in a constant low-level fight with Iran, even without direct state-on-state war.
That's exactly their perspective. It's a persistent, ongoing conflict fought through these intermediaries.
Okay, so that's the threat landscape from Israel's view.
Yeah.
How does Iran's actual military stack up? You hear about their missiles, but what's the bigger picture?
It's a real mix, actually, a study in contrast, mostly because of those long-term sanctions.
Right.
On the plus side, Iran has a large conventional army. And then there's the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. They're elite, operate somewhat separately, and are very ideologically driven.
And they focused on asymmetric stuff, right? Missiles, drones.
And very much so. They've invested heavily there and shown they can use them effectively in the region. That gives them reach, a strike capability.
But what about the weaknesses?
Big ones. Their air forces, well, it's old. Mostly planes from before the revolution. Think F-4s, F-14.
Relics, almost.
And getting spare parts, modernizing. The sanctions have made that incredibly difficult.
Yep.
Same goes for air defense systems. They're nowhere near as sophisticated as what Israel or the U.S. has.
So they can launch things, but defending their own sky is a major problem.
Significantly compromised, yes. It's a military built more for deterrence, for projecting power regionally through asymmetric means, not really for a full-on conventional war against a high-tech enemy.
And going back to the nuclear issue, you mentioned Israel's profound distrust of Iran's intentions. It sounds like they just fundamentally don't believe anything Iran says about its program being peaceful.
That's a really crucial psychological element, and it's tied heavily to a specific parallel. North Korea.
Right.
Israeli strategists and many U.S. hardliners, too, constantly bring up North Korea. They argue North Korea played the diplomatic game, signed deals, got concessions.
All secretly building the bomb. The whole
That's the narrative, yes. That North Korea cheated, lied, and ultimately got nuclear weapons despite agreements. And they see Iran through that exact same lens.
So any deal with Iran, in their view, is just buying time for Iran to cheat.
That's the core belief for many, that a regime like Iran's, which they see as ideologically committed to destroying Israel, simply cannot be trusted, period. So the conclusion is Iran will go for nukes no matter what they sign. It makes building any kind of trust incredibly difficult, maybe impossible.
So with that level of deep, almost unshakable distrust, Israel's goals regarding Iran become pretty straightforward, don't they?
Crystal clear, really.
Yeah.
It's a multi-layered containment strategy. Goal number one, above all else, prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons, whatever it takes.
Not just delay, prevent.
Exactly. Second, stop Iran funding and arming those proxies. Hamas, Hezbollah, cut off that support network. That means intelligence, strikes against supply lines, everything. And third, keep the economic pressure on. Maintain tough sanctions to weaken Iran's economy, limit its ability to fund the nuclear program and the proxies.
So it's about degrading their capability across the board.
It's a strategy of preemptive defense, based on that core belief that Iran is an existential threat that needs constant containment and, if necessary, direct confrontation.
Iran's nuclear trajectory and the breakdown of diplomacy.
Okay, so we've got Israel's perspective. Clear, deep suspicion, focus on prevention. Let's flip it now. How does Iran see its own nuclear program? It sounds like for their leadership, especially Supreme Leader Khamenei, it's not just an option, it's seen as vital for survival.
Absolutely vital. This isn't just about energy for them, despite the public statements. The leadership in Iran, Khamenei in particular, looked very closely at what happened with other countries.
And they drew lessons.
They drew a very specific lesson, often citing North Korea again, but from the opposite angle.
How so?
The thinking goes like this. Countries that get nuclear weapons, like North Korea, they gain a certain immunity. They don't get invaded. They have leverage
Whereas countries that give them up or never get them.
and remain vulnerable. Vulnerable to pressure, to regime change, maybe even invasion. Look at Libya, look at Iraq. That's the conclusion they reached.
So for them, having a nuclear capability, or at least being very close to it, became essential for the survival of the Islamic Republic itself.
It became a non-negotiable pillar of their national security strategy, an existential imperative, not just a nice to have. And that conviction really shapes everything they do on this front.
Which leads us right into the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, that big diplomatic effort under the Obama administration.
Right, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Negotiated with the P5+1, the big Security Council powers plus Germany. It was a massive international attempt to manage Iran's program through diplomacy, not war.
And Iran agreed to some pretty significant restrictions under that deal, didn't they?
Very significant. They agreed to limit uranium enrichment to just 3.67%, which is only useful for power plants, nowhere near the 90% needed for a weapon.
Okay.
They drastically cut their number of centrifuges, redesigned a reactor so it couldn't produce weapons-grade plutonium easily, shipped out most of their enriched uranium stockpile.
And allowed inspectors in.
Intense inspections. The IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, gained unprecedented access under the NPT framework. It was supposed to be rigorously monitored.
And there was a real sense of hope back then, in 2015.
Huge relief globally. Sanctions were lifted, Iran's economy was supposed to open up, people expected more stability, maybe even lower oil prices as Iranian oil came back online. It felt like a major crisis averted through diplomacy.
But then, 2018, President Trump pulls the U.S. out, unilaterally.
Just walked away, sending shockwaves, especially among the European allies who'd helped broker the deal and wanted to keep it alive.
Why? What was the thinking behind that decision?
Well, there was intense lobbying, no doubt about it. From pro-Israel hardliners in the U.S. and also influential figures inside the Trump administration itself, people like Jared Kushner were reportedly very involved.
And their argument was?
The same fundamental distrust we talked about, that Iran couldn't be trusted with any enrichment, even monitored. They kept bringing up North Korea, saying Iran would cheat just like North Korea supposedly did.
So the deal itself was flawed, in their eyes.
Fundamentally flawed, yes. They also argued it didn't cover Iran's ballistic missiles or its support for proxies, and they hated the sunset clauses, the fact that some restrictions would expire over time.
Okay, so the U.S. pulls out, and then they bring back sanctions.
Immediately. And not just U.S. sanctions, but those powerful secondary sanctions.
Right, the ones that hit other countries or companies trading with Iran.
Exactly. If you did significant business with Iran, especially using U.S. dollars, you faced penalties. It effectively froze Iran out of the global financial system again, designed to cripple their economy, force them back to the table for a better deal.
But here's the paradox, isn't it? Did pulling out actually make things safer? Or did it push Iran closer to the bomb?
That's the core debate. By withdrawing, the U.S. arguably removed the constraints on Iran's program. For hardliners in Iran, it proved their point. You can't trust international agreements, only self-reliance matters. It fed this cycle of distrust and escalation.
So how did Iran react, facing those crippling sanctions again, seeing the deal collapse?
Their response was gradual but deliberate. They basically said, if the U.S. isn't holding up its end, why should we? They waited a bit, hoping Europe could somehow shield them from U.S. sanctions. But that didn't really materialize. So they started systematically breaking the JCPOA limits.
Ramping up enrichment again.
Yep. First back up to 20%, then eventually hitting 60%, which is technically very close to the 90% weapons grade level. They started using more advanced centrifuges the deal had forbidden, building up their stockpile of enriched uranium again.
And from Israel's point of view, watching this happen.
That was the breaking point. Seeing Iran making these rapid advances, seeing diplomacy seemingly going nowhere. They felt the clock was ticking.
The breakout time, the time Iran would need to make enough material for a bomb, was shrinking rapidly.
Exactly. And that perception led directly to those recent Israeli strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities. It was a massive escalation the first time Israel had overtly hit those kinds of targets inside Iran, moving beyond sabotage and proxy fights to direct military action on Iranian soil.
What was their justification for taking such a huge step?
Their public rationale was clear. Iran wasn't serious about talks. They were racing towards nuclear capability, especially at places like Fordo and Natanz, which are deeply buried. Israel felt they had no choice left but military action to prevent Iran crossing that threshold.
To stop what they see as an existential threat becoming reality.
Precisely. And it's critical to remember the U.S. reportedly knew about these strikes beforehand. That implies a level of coordination, or at least tacit American approval. This wasn't just Israel acting alone in a vacuum.
The threat of full-scale war, Iran's retaliation cards.
So Israel strikes Iran's nuclear sites directly. Iran retaliates with missiles. Where does that leave things? It feels incredibly tense, like we're teetering on the edge of something much bigger.
Definitely in an escalating phase. And the big question hanging over everything is the possibility of direct U.S. military involvement. The stakes are incredibly high right now.
And the U.S. military seems to be preparing for that possibility. We're seeing major deployments.
Oh, yeah. Very visible preparations. Multiple aircraft carrier groups moved into the region. Advanced stealth bombers, the kind that can carry those GBU-57 bunker busters.
Those are the ones designed to hit deeply buried targets, right? Like Fordow.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Capable of penetrating, potentially tens of meters of rock and concrete, sending a very clear signal about U.S. capabilities against even Iran's most hardened facilities. Plus, lots of aerial refueling tankers, essential for long-range strikes.
And reports suggest contingency plans for military action have been approved.
Reports indicate that plans exist, approved at high levels, basically waiting for a final order, perhaps contingent on Iran refusing to completely dismantle its nuclear program or hitting U.S. interests directly. The U.S. seems ready, or at least signaling readiness for major intervention.
If the U.S. does get directly involved militarily, what could that look like beyond just airstrikes? Could it destabilize Iran internally?
That's a real risk. A major U.S. military campaign could potentially fuel internal unrest. Iran isn't monolithic. There are ethnic groups, political factions, widespread economic discontent. A large-scale external attack could worsen those divisions, maybe even trigger uprisings or attempts at rebellion.
Turning it from a state-on-state conflict into something much messier, like a civil war scenario.
It's a possibility, and that kind of chaotic, wider war is something nobody really wants. The consequences would be unpredictable and devastating for the whole region and probably beyond.
Okay, so assuming Iran doesn't just back down, what are its options? How can it retaliate further against Israel or its allies? The sources lay out 5 main retaliation cards.
Right, 5 potential scenarios for how Iran might respond or escalate further.
Let's start with number 1. Direct airstrikes on Israeli territory. We've already seen this happen, as you said.
Correct. Iran launched that barrage of ballistic missiles and drones right after the Israeli strike.
But how effective was it really?
Honestly, not very. For a couple of key reasons. First, the distance is huge. It gives Israel and its allies a lot of time to detect and track incoming threats.
And second, Israel's air defenses.
They're incredibly advanced. Multi-layered systems, Iron Dome for short-range stuff, David Sling for medium, the Arrow system for ballistic missiles. They intercepted the vast majority of what Iran threw at them.
So, despite the dramatic images, the actual damage on the ground was minimal.
Seems so. Iran might claim they hit important targets, Israel downplays it, but objectively it looks like the impact was limited. It was more about making a statement, showing they could reach Israel, rather than inflicting major military damage.
Okay, so if direct strikes aren't working that well, what's card number 2? Expanding support for their regional proxy groups. Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis.
This is where Iran has traditionally been very effective. It's their long-game strategy using these groups as a forward defense, keeping the fight away from Iranian soil.
Let's break them down again in this context. Hamas and Palestine.
Iran could definitely ramp up support here. More money, more advanced weapons, better rockets, anti-tank missiles, perhaps more training. This could fuel more intense fighting from Gaza, tying up Israeli forces, increasing casualties. It keeps that southern front active and volatile.
And Hezbollah in Lebanon. They're already a major threat.
Hezbollah is Iran's crown jewel proxy. Highly trained, heavily armed with potentially, 150,000 or more rockets and missiles, including precision ones. Iran could encourage or enable them to open up a major second front against Israel from the north.
That would be a nightmare scenario for Israel.
Absolutely. A full-scale conflict with Hezbollah would be devastating for both sides, far more intense than the 2006 war. Hezbollah has combat experience from Syria, knows the terrain, and could inflict serious damage inside Israel.
And then the Houthis in Yemen. They've already been disrupting shipping.
Right. The Iranian-backed Houthis have shown they can hit shipping in the Red Sea, using drones and missiles. They've already forced ships to reroute around Africa, impacting global trade via the Suez Canal.
Didn't they also fire missiles towards Tel Aviv recently?
They did, aiming for the airport, causing flight disruptions, shows their increasing reach. Iran could encourage more of these attacks, further disrupting trade, maybe even trying to hit targets deeper inside Israel or Saudi Arabia. It adds another layer of pressure.
Okay, that brings us to the third card. Direct attacks on U.S. military bases in the Middle East. That sounds like crossing a major line.
A huge line, extremely provocative. We've seen smaller attacks by militias linked to Iran on U.S. personnel in Iraq and Syria before, but a direct, large-scale Iranian attack on a major U.S. base. That would almost certainly trigger a massive U.S. military response directly against Iran.
The U.S. has warned against this pretty explicitly, haven't they?
Very clearly. Public warnings of severe, unprecedented retaliation if U.S. personnel or facilities are hit significantly. Iran knows this. It would likely mean direct U.S. strikes on Iranian soil, possibly targeting IRGC command centers, missile sites, maybe even leadership.
So it's a really high-risk option for Iran, probably a last resort.
Very high risk. They'd have to feel incredibly desperate or cornered to take that step, knowing it could lead to a devastating war with the U.S., which they almost certainly couldn't win conventionally.
Then there's the fourth card, targeting oil facilities in countries friendly to the U.S. or Israel, hitting them where it hurts economically.
This is a potent asymmetric option. Iran could use missiles or drones to strike oil fields, processing plants, export terminals in places like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, maybe Qatar, Bahrain.
Saudi Arabia seems particularly vulnerable, being such a huge producer.
Exactly. And remember those 2019 attacks on Abqaiq and Kurais? Attributed to Iran or its proxies, they temporarily cut Saudi oil output in half. Shows the potential. Plus, Saudi Arabia's recent moves towards normalizing relations with Israel under the Abraham Accords. That makes them an even bigger target in Iran's eyes.
Iran's also warned Arab countries about letting Israeli planes use their airspace, right?
Yes, implying those countries could become targets too. An attack on major Gulf oil infrastructure would instantly send global oil prices skyrocketing. Massive economic shockwaves, inflation, potential recession. It generates huge international pressure.
And that leads to the fifth, and perhaps the ultimate, card, the Hormuz Strait blockade, the global economy's choke point.
The Hormuz Strait, the world economy's pressure point.
Right, the Strait of Hormuz. When you look at a map, its importance just jumps out at you. It's this tiny bottleneck for so much of the world's energy.
It's unbelievably critical. This narrow strip of water connects the Persian Gulf, where all that oil and gas from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, and Iran comes from, to the open ocean, the Arabian Sea.
And the sheer volume of oil passing through.
Yeah.
It's staggering.
Around 30% of all the oil transported by sea globally goes through Hormuz every single day. Plus, a huge amount of liquefied natural gas, LNG. It's the absolute lifeline for global energy markets.
And it's physically very narrow, right, which makes it vulnerable.
Very narrow. The whole strait is only about 31 kilometers, maybe 21 miles wide at its narrowest. But the actual shipping lanes, deep enough for giant oil tankers, are even narrower, just a few kilometers wide in each direction.
So easy to disrupt.
Relatively easy, yes. Mines, fast attack boats, anti-ship missiles fired from shore. It's a natural choke point.
So if Iran were to actually blockade it, or even just seriously threaten to, the global impact would be catastrophic.
Absolutely devastating. Forget gradual price rises. Even a credible threat, let alone actually closing it, could cause oil and gas prices to spike almost overnight to levels we've possibly never seen before.
Way beyond past oil shocks.
Potentially, yes. And it's not just energy prices. A closure paralyzes global shipping. Think about all the container ships, not just tankers. They'd have to take the hugely long, expensive route around Africa.
Driving the costs for everything.
Everything. Shipping costs soar. Insurance premiums for vessels going anywhere near there become astronomical. It triggers massive inflation globally, hits supply chains everywhere, and could easily tip the world economy into a deep recession, maybe worse.
It sounds like the ultimate economic weapon for Iran. A way to hold the world hostage, almost. So why haven't they used it? Why do the sources suggest a full, sustained blockade is actually pretty unlikely?
It is their most powerful theoretical card, no doubt. But actually playing it comes with enormous risks and constraints for Iran itself. There are basically 5 big reasons why a full blockade is highly improbable.
Okay, let's break those down. What's the first one?
International law. Iran signed treaties, like the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, that guarantee free passage through international straits. A blockade is a clear violation. It would bring universal condemnation and likely trigger a massive international response, legally and possibly militarily. Plus, historically, it's never been fully closed, even during the height of the Iran-Iraq War's tanker war. That sets a strong precedent.
Okay, law and precedent. What's number 2?
Oman. A big chunk of the Deepwater Channel actually runs through Oman's territorial waters, not Iran's. Oman tries to stay somewhat neutral, balancing ties with Iran and the West. They have zero interest in the strait being closed and wouldn't likely allow Iran to control their waters for a blockade. It complicates Iranian control.
It makes sense.
Third reason, the U.S. Navy. Specifically, the Fifth Fleet, based right there in Bahrain. Their primary mission includes keeping Hormuz open. Any serious attempt by Iran to mine the strait or attack shipping would almost certainly lead to direct conflict with the U.S. Navy. And frankly, Iran can't win a sustained naval fight against the U.S. in the strait.
Right. The military imbalance is huge.
Yeah.
What's number 4? This one seems crucial.
Economic self-harm, or, as you called it, auto-sabotage. This might be the biggest deterrent. Over 90% of Iran's own trade, its exports and imports, including the oil it sells and the food and medicine it needs, goes through Hormuz.
So blocking it means blocking their own lifeline.
Completely. It would devastate their already crippled economy almost instantly. They couldn't export oil, couldn't import essentials. It would likely cause massive internal unrest, potentially collapsing their economy. It's cutting off your nose to spite your face on a national scale.
Wow. Okay, and the 5th reason.
Impact on allies, particularly China. China is Iran's biggest oil customer and a vital economic and strategic partner, especially with Iran isolated from the West. Closing Hormuz hits China's energy supplies hard. It would also hurt India and other Asian buyers. Iran cannot afford to alienate its few remaining major partners. They would face immense pressure from Beijing and others to reopen the strait immediately.
So putting it all together, a full long-term blockade looks like a suicidal move for Iran, really.
Pretty much, yes. The costs and risks likely far outweigh any potential strategic gain.
But does that mean the Hormuz threat is completely off the table? Could Iran use it in a more limited way, maybe just threats or minor disruptions, to create chaos and pressure?
That's the nuance, exactly. While a full blockade is improbable, Iran might absolutely resort to partial measures or credible threats, especially now after being hit directly by Israel on its nuclear sites. They might feel they have to show more strength than just those ineffective missile strikes.
So not closing it completely, but making it dangerous. Harassing ships, maybe laying a few mines, making noise.
Precisely. Conducting aggressive naval drills, temporarily detaining ships, maybe even small-scale attacks on less critical vessels. The goal wouldn't be to stop all traffic, but to inject fear and uncertainty.
To drive up insurance costs, make shippers nervous, rattle global markets.
Yes. And ultimately, to create so much global economic anxiety that international pressure mounts on Israel and the U.S. to back off, to de-escalate. It's using the fear of Hormuz closing as a weapon. Psychological warfare on a global scale.
But that's still risky, isn't it? Couldn't that easily backfire?
Hugely risky. It's a very fine line. Actions like that could easily galvanize more international opposition against Iran, not less. Instead of pressuring Israel, it could strengthen the resolve for tougher action against Iran from a wider coalition. It might lead to more isolation, harsher sanctions, maybe even justify military intervention in the eyes of some.
So it's a powerful tool, but one they'd have to use incredibly carefully, knowing it could blow up in their face.
Extremely carefully. The potential for blowback is immense.
Outro.
So as we pull back from the specifics, it's just so clear, isn't it? This conflict, while playing out in the Middle East, is so much bigger than just one region. It really feels like it could shift the global order in significant ways.
Absolutely. And the effects, they aren't abstract geopolitical concepts. They're already reaching into your life right now.
Yeah.
You see it in the stock market volatility. You feel it in rising oil prices affecting what you pay for gas, for heating. It impacts currency exchange rates, the cost of goods coming from overseas. It demonstrates just how tangled up our world economy is with stability in places like the Middle East. It's a powerful reminder that these events, even if they seem geographically distant, have very real, tangible consequences for all of us every day. So as this incredibly complex and, frankly, dangerous situation keeps evolving, here's something to think about. What are the wider implications here? If this conflict keeps escalating, what does it mean for global stability, for the economic landscape, maybe for years to come?
As nations grapple with things like energy security again, rethinking supply chains, maybe seeing alliances shift, how will they adapt?
And maybe closer to home.
Yeah.
In this changing reality, what choices do we face? As consumers, as investors, just as people trying to understand the forces shaping our interconnected world, something to keep pondering long after this deep dive ends.